For the last 40 years or so, the playbook for global manufacturing was incredibly straightforward. Just move production to China. It was all about cheap labor, massive scale, and absolutely extreme efficiency. And honestly, it worked brilliantly. But right now, we are witnessing a monumental, albeit quiet, shift. Companies are rapidly packing up and moving production back closer to home or to nearby allied countries. The era of the heavily centralized global supply chain is ending, and we're moving toward these highly resilient, regionalized networks.
There's a phrase echoing around boardrooms right now that perfectly captures this. Supply chains are no longer just about cost, they're about control, speed, and survival. And this isn't happening because globalization was some kind of complete failure. It's happening because the underlying risks of the world have fundamentally changed. That 4-decade-old strategy of prioritizing cheap labor above literally everything else is being replaced. This phenomenon is known as nearshoring or reshoring, and let me tell you, it's reshaping global trade far faster than most people realize.
So to understand exactly how this massive shift is playing out, here is our roadmap for today's explainer. We're going to cover the era of efficiency, why the system broke, redrawing the manufacturing map, how automation changes the math, and finally, the actual cost of resilience.
All right, part 1, the era of efficiency. Let's set the baseline. To really understand where we're going, we have to quickly look at the old world rules of manufacturing that dominated from the 1980s right up until about 2020. The golden rule was incredibly simple. Just produce wherever it's cheapest. To put that into perspective, at its absolute peak, China was pumping out roughly a quarter to over a third of the entire world's manufacturing output. That is a staggering concentration of production. The whole system relied on significantly lower labor costs, massive industrial clusters that created extreme-scale efficiency, and container shipping that made global transport cheap and predictable. Western companies designed the products, China manufactured them, and the goods were shipped right back to global consumers. And hey, the perks of this highly centralized system were undeniable. It gave us way lower consumer prices at the store, much higher corporate margins, and fueled rapid global economic growth. But it also hid a very dangerous reliance on incredibly long, fragile, and highly concentrated supply chains. Everything worked perfectly right up until it didn't. Which brings us to part 2, why the system broke and how that extreme fragility finally got exposed. Those seemingly flawless global supply chains suddenly began to fracture under the weight of disruptive forces and unexpected shocks. Think back to the timeline of recent years. Pre-2020, geopolitical cracks were already starting to show, with US-China trade tensions bringing increased tariffs and export controls. Then, 2020 hit, and the COVID-19 pandemic entirely paralyzed global supply lines. By 2021, the Suez Canal blockage vividly demonstrated route dependency risk. Think about it. One single stuck ship halted billions of dollars in trade. And post-2021, semiconductor shortages literally brought entire industries to a standstill, highlighting the massive single-point dependency risk of relying so heavily on specific regions.
All of this forced a crucial and frankly very expensive realization. The cheapest supply chain is not always the most reliable one. Companies learned a very hard lesson here. Critical industries simply cannot rely on a single geographic region anymore. Today, the new priorities are all about diversification, redundancy, and speed of recovery, not just trying to squeeze out every last penny of cost.
Okay, part 3. Redrawing the manufacturing map. Let's look at the real-world shift. This isn't just theory anymore. Industries are actively adapting right now by physically picking up and moving their operations. We are seeing very specific regions emerge as the absolute winners in a massive global land grab for production. Mexico is absolutely booming as the North American hub, largely benefiting from being right next door to the US and taking advantage of trade rules like the USMCA. It's heavily attracting automotive and EV supply chains. Meanwhile, Vietnam and India are rising rapidly as Asian diversification hubs. We're seeing major apparel brands rapidly moving production over there. And Eastern Europe is solidifying as a European nearshore base. Even highly strategic sectors like semiconductors are packing up and shifting. We are decentralizing the world's factory.
Moving on to part 4, automation changes the math. This is the hidden driver. We know the risks pushed companies to move, but there's a surprising technological catalyst that makes all this reshoring financially viable in the first place.
You might be wondering, how can they afford to leave cheap labor behind? Well, in modern manufacturing systems, thanks to robotics and incredibly smart software-driven factories, labor actually only makes up about 10 to 25% of the total costs now. It is no longer the dominant factor it once was. Plus, keep in mind, manufacturing wages in China have risen significantly over the past 2 decades anyway. Because automation has drastically reduced the need for human labor, chasing the absolute cheapest wages globally just doesn't offer the massive competitive advantage it used to. This fundamentally flips the whole paradigm. In the old world, the only question that mattered was, where is labor cheapest? But in the new world, the strategic mindset has completely shifted to, where is production most reliable, fast, and controllable? Shipping delays matter way more today. Supply shocks are far more expensive than minor labor differences. Speed to market and geographic proximity are suddenly incredibly valuable assets.
Which brings us to our final section, Part 5, the cost of resilience. It's time for a reality check, because we need to look at the actual math and see what this nearshoring shift means for real-world profit margins.
Let's look at a simplified real-world comparison for a consumer electronics component. On paper, manufacturing that part in China might total around $17 to $18 per unit, largely driven by incredibly cheap shipping and massive scale. In Mexico, labor and overhead are slightly higher, bringing the total closer to maybe $19 or $21. So yes, China looks slightly cheaper on a spreadsheet. But manufacturing in Mexico eliminates massive systemic risks, tariffs, extreme shipping delays, and geopolitical disruptions. Those hidden risks don't show up in standard unit costs, but they will absolutely destroy real profit margins if a crisis hits.
So, how does this connect directly to your wallet? Well, here is the timeline of consumer price impacts. In the short term, say between 2024 and 2028, we'll likely see slight price bumps of about 5 to 10%. That's just the massive cost of restructuring and duplicating these global supply chains. But in the midterm, stretching from 2028 to 2035, prices should stabilize as these new regional systems mature and automation further offsets those cost increases. Finally, in the long term, from 2035 onward, we're looking at much more stable pricing with fewer global shocks and way lower volatility in inflation cycles.
The core thesis of this massive global reset really comes down to a simple trade-off. Efficiency is slightly reduced, but stability is significantly improved. Companies are making a deliberate, conscious choice. They're accepting a slightly higher but predictable cost in exchange for significantly lower systemic risk. Predictability at scale almost always beats marginal savings.
Which leaves us with a pretty vital question to think about. Will we ever return to the era of one global factory? As we shift permanently from efficiency-first globalization to resilience-first regionalization, we really have to wonder if the age of the ultra-cheap, centralized supply chain is just gone forever.
By understanding this structural reset, you can see exactly why industries are relocating and why global trade has changed forever. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. If you found this breakdown helpful, be sure to stick around so we can keep navigating these massive global shifts together. And definitely keep an eye out for our next explainer, where we are going to break down one of the most important supply chain choke points in modern history, the Red Sea crisis, and how one extremely narrow waterway managed to disrupt delivery timelines across the entire world. Uncover, understand, stay ahead. I'll see you next time.